On March 1, 2024, Elon Musk filed a lawsuit against the organization he had helped create, not for money, for a mission. OpenAI was founded in 2015 as a nonprofit with one explicit purpose: develop artificial general intelligence safely and ensure its benefits were distributed to all of humanity, not captured by a single company. That was the promise. The legal filing argued it had been replaced by something else entirely, a for-profit enterprise backed by over $13 billion from Microsoft, operating under a governance structure that its own board had already failed to enforce. The filing did not create this contradiction. It had been building for years, visible in specific decisions, specific departures, specific reversals of specific commitments. What the lawsuit did was make the contradiction impossible to explain away. This is the story of how one of the most consequential organizations in the world drifted from its founding mission, and why that drift may not be reversible. In 2015, a group of researchers and technologists gathered around a problem that most of the world had not yet taken seriously. The problem was not that artificial intelligence was failing. The problem was that it might succeed completely, irreversibly, and under the control of a single actor with no obligation to anyone outside its own walls. That possibility, they argued, was too consequential to leave to the market alone. OpenAI was their answer to that problem, and the structure they built around it was not an accident. The organization was incorporated as a nonprofit, not because nonprofits are more efficient or because the tax treatment was favorable, but because a nonprofit cannot be acquired. It cannot be taken public. It does not have shareholders demanding a return. The people who designed OpenAI's legal structure chose that form deliberately because they believed the mission required a container that commercial pressure could not dissolve. The founding documents said as much. The purpose was to ensure that artificial general intelligence, if and when it arrived, would benefit humanity broadly, not the investors who happened to fund the lab that built it first. Elon Musk was not a passive donor to that vision. He was a co-founder. He participated in recruiting the initial research team, contributed approximately $100 million in early commitments, and lent his public profile to an organization that was, at the time, unknown outside a narrow slice of the AI research world. His involvement was a signal to other serious people that this was a serious project. That credibility mattered enormously in those early years. Sam Altman joined as president. Greg Brockman became chairman. Ilya Sutskever, one of the most respected researchers in deep learning, left Google to become chief scientist. These were not people chasing a business opportunity. The salaries were below market. The structure offered no equity upside. They came because the mission felt real and the risk of not acting felt larger than the risk of trying. The open in OpenAI was also deliberate. The founding philosophy held that safety research conducted behind closed doors was less safe than research published openly, scrutinized by the broader scientific community, and built upon by people outside any single institution. This was a direct counter-argument to the model being used by the largest technology companies, where AI capabilities were developed internally, shared selectively, and protected as competitive advantages. OpenAI at its founding rejected that model entirely. Nobody had a poster of OpenAI on their wall. Nobody felt emotional about a nonprofit research charter. But the organization had something that mattered more than affection in a field moving as fast as AI was moving. It had a structural commitment. An architecture specifically designed to hold the mission in place even when commercial logic pushed in the opposite direction. That architecture was the whole point. It was the reason serious people joined. It was the reason serious donors gave money. It was the implicit promise to the public that this particular organization, unlike the others, was built to resist the forces that tend to reshape every institution that encounters enough money. That structure held until it didn't. In 2019, OpenAI announced it was restructuring. The language used at the time was careful and practical. The organization needed access to more capital than a traditional nonprofit could raise. The compute costs required to pursue frontier AI. Research were scaling faster than donations could support, and a new vehicle was needed to attract the kind of investment that could keep pace with well-resourced competitors. The announcement framed this as a necessary evolution, not a departure. This was not a funding solution. It was a governance transformation disguised as one. The new structure OpenAI created was called capped profit. Investors could participate and receive returns, but those returns were capped at 100 times their investment. Above that ceiling, any value generated would flow back to the nonprofit. The nonprofit, in turn, would retain oversight of the for-profit entity and ensure the mission remained intact. On paper, the mechanism sounded like a reasonable compromise between the idealism of the founding and the realities of building at scale. What the announcement did not emphasize was what the structure actually changed. The nonprofit's ability to enforce the mission now depended on its ability to exercise control over an entity that was simultaneously attracting billions of dollars from some of the most commercially motivated actors in the technology industry. The cap was a ceiling on investor returns. It was not a ceiling on commercial pressure. Microsoft's entry made the tension concrete. In 2019, the company committed $1 billion to OpenAI, the first major external investment under the new structure. That number grew. By 2023, Microsoft's total investment had reached approximately $13 billion, and OpenAI's models had been integrated deeply into Microsoft's Azure cloud infrastructure, its Office productivity suite, and its Bing search engine. Microsoft did not invest $13 billion in a nonprofit mission. It invested in a product pipeline. Elon Musk had already left OpenAI's board before the Microsoft relationship reached that scale. He departed in 2018, citing potential conflicts with Tesla's own AI development work. But the record of his communications from that period, later made public through the lawsuit, suggested a different concern was also present. The direction the organization was taking did not match the structure it had been given. The moment that told that story most clearly came with GPT-2, released in 2019. OpenAI initially withheld the full model from public release, citing concerns about potential misuse. The decision was reasonable on its face, but it was also the first time the organization had declined to share its research openly, which was, in the founding philosophy, the entire point. The open in the name was no longer a description of how the organization operated. It had become a memory of what the organization had originally intended to be. The nonprofit did not disappear. It just stopped being in charge. For 5 days in November 2023, OpenAI's board fired its own CEO and then reversed course under pressure so intense that the reversal was complete within a week. For 5 days in November 2023, OpenAI's board fired its own CEO and then reversed course under pressure so intense that the reversal was complete within a week. That sequence of events was reported widely as a chaotic internal power struggle, confusing, dramatic, ultimately resolved. What it actually was is harder to look at directly. The board that fired Sam Altman was the board designed to exist for exactly that moment. OpenAI's nonprofit governance structure gave the board one essential function: to place the mission above commercial interest when those two things came into conflict. Altman's removal was the board attempting to do that job. The stated reasons included a lack of candor with the board and concerns about the pace and direction of the organization's development. The specifics were not made fully public, but the board acted, which meant the structural safeguard, the one everyone had been assured was real, was working. Then it stopped working. Within days, nearly 500 OpenAI employees signed a letter threatening to resign and join Microsoft if Altman was not reinstated. Microsoft, which had by that point committed over $13 billion to OpenAI and had integrated its technology into products used by hundreds of millions of people, made clear that Altman would have a home there if the board held its position. The board did not hold its position. Altman returned. Most of the board members who had voted to remove him were gone within weeks, replaced by individuals with closer ties to the investor and commercial side of the organization. The mission did not lose in a dramatic confrontation. It lost in a negotiation that lasted less than a fortnight, driven not by argument but by the weight of capital already deployed. Ilya Sutskever, the chief scientist who had initially voted to remove Altman and then publicly expressed regret about it, remained at the company for several more months before departing in May 2024 to found his own safety-focused AI organization. His exit statement described a belief that keeping frontier AI safe required a structure oriented entirely around that goal. The implication of that statement, given where he was leaving, was not subtle. The November 2023 crisis mattered because it answered a question that the capped profit restructuring had left open. The question was, when commercial pressure and mission requirements collide, which one wins? The board crisis answered it. The last institutional check had been tested under real conditions. It had failed. By the time the dust settled, there was no longer any structural mechanism left to enforce the original mission. Consider what OpenAI looked like by 2024, measured not by its public statements but by its actual decisions. GPT-4, released in March 2023, was not open. The model weights were not published. The training data was not disclosed. The technical report that accompanied the release explicitly declined to share the methodology, citing competitive considerations and safety concerns simultaneously. Two rationales that conveniently pointed in the same direction. The organization named for openness had produced its most capable system, and told the research community almost nothing about how it worked. The safety team that had been central to OpenAI's identity had been losing people for years, but the departures accelerated. Researchers who had joined specifically because of the mission found themselves working inside a product company operating on product timelines. The gap between what the safety team recommended and what the product team shipped was described by multiple former employees in public statements after their departures as a consistent and widening. One, individual researchers raised concerns. The concerns were noted. The products shipped anyway. The proposed conversion to a fully for-profit structure, which Altman and OpenAI's leadership began discussing publicly in 2024, would have dissolved the nonprofit's controlling position entirely. Under the proposed terms, the nonprofit would receive a financial settlement, a cash payout in exchange for relinquishing the oversight role it had been designed to hold permanently. The mission would be monetized and set aside. What had been described as a permanent structural commitment would become a transaction. The AGI benefit clause embedded in OpenAI's agreement with Microsoft added another layer. Under the terms of that agreement, Microsoft's special access to OpenAI's technology would be modified once OpenAI determined that AGI had been achieved, with OpenAI itself making that determination. The clause was designed to protect humanity from any single company controlling AGI. In practice, it gave OpenAI the unilateral power to decide when that threshold had been crossed, with significant financial consequences riding on the answer. Each of these things alone might have been explained away. The closed release was a safety precaution. The safety team departures were a normal feature of any organization's evolution. The for-profit conversion was a structural necessity. The AG clause was a reasonable compromise negotiated in good faith. Together they told a different story. The story said that OpenAI was no longer the world's safeguard against the dangers of concentrated AI development. It had become a product company with an exceptional origin story, operating inside a commercial structure that rewarded acceleration and made genuine deceleration nearly impossible. The pattern was not a conspiracy, it was a gravitational pull, and the organization had been inside it long enough that the original trajectory was no longer visible from the inside. Musk had been watching, and in March 2024 he stopped watching. On March 1, 2024, Elon Musk filed suit against OpenAI Inc., Sam Altman and Greg Brockman in a California court. The filing ran to dozens of pages. Its core argument was not complicated. Musk's lawsuit claimed that OpenAI had entered into a binding agreement with its founders and donors, that the technology it developed would be kept open, that the organization would remain nonprofit, and that the work would be conducted for the benefit of humanity broadly, rather than for any private commercial interest. It then claimed that each of those commitments had been broken. Not eroded, not revised, broken. The legal filing asked the court not primarily for monetary damages, but for injunctive relief. An order requiring OpenAI to honor the terms of its founding agreement and return to open publication of its research. This was not a dispute between two billionaires with competing business interests. That framing, which appeared quickly in media coverage and in OpenAI's own public response, was the most effective way to shrink the question down to something dismissible. The actual charge was larger. It was a claim that a public trust, a promise made to the scientific community and to the world about how the most consequential technology in human history would be developed, had been quietly discarded once the commercial opportunity became clear enough. OpenAI's response arrived within days. It was personal, pointed, and notably short on substantive engagement with the structural claims. The public statement emphasized Musk's own business interests, his ownership of a competing AI company, and what it characterized as his long-standing desire for control over OpenAI's direction. These may have been accurate observations. They were not answers to the questions the lawsuit raised. The response said a great deal about what OpenAI was willing to defend and what it preferred to redirect. When an institution responds to a structural critique by questioning the motives of the person making it, the structural critique has usually landed somewhere sensitive. What the filing made impossible to ignore was the gap between what OpenAI said about itself and what its actual decisions had produced. The lawsuit did not create that gap. It had been building for years, visible in specific policy changes and specific departures, in closed model releases and restructured governance. What the lawsuit did was force the question into a space where OpenAI could not manage the narrative entirely on its own terms. For the first time, the contradiction was on record in a public legal document that anyone could read. The insight embedded in Musk's legal filing becomes clearer when you look at what OpenAI's structure actually incentivizes, not what it says, but what the architecture rewards. Start with the investors. Microsoft committed over $13 billion to OpenAI across multiple funding rounds. That capital sits inside a capped profit structure, which means returns are theoretically limited, but the cap is not the relevant constraint. The relevant constraint is time. Investors in a structure like this need the underlying technology to generate commercial value before their position becomes worthless. The faster OpenAI's models become indispensable to enterprise customers, to developers, to governments, to the platforms running on Azure, the better the investment looks. Slowness, by definition, works against them, and the people designing OpenAI's product roadmap operate inside that pressure every day, whether or not it is ever stated explicitly. Then there is Microsoft's operational dependency. Azure is OpenAI's exclusive cloud provider. OpenAI's training runs, its API infrastructure, its product delivery, all of it flows through Microsoft's systems. That relationship generated enormous revenue for Microsoft and gave OpenAI the compute capacity it needed to build frontier models. It also meant that OpenAI's ability to operate at all was contingent on maintaining a relationship that Microsoft had strong incentives to keep accelerating. You do not slow down for a partner whose entire data center strategy is built around your growth. Altman's own position completed the picture. His public profile, his influence in Washington, his standing in the AI industry, his ability to raise the next funding round, all of it depended on OpenAI continuing to lead. Leading meant shipping. Shipping meant moving faster than the competition. Moving faster than the competition and simultaneously conducting the kind of careful, iterative safety evaluation the original mission implied are not impossible to reconcile, but they require a structural commitment to prioritize safety even when it costs time. That structural commitment was the non-profit board's job to enforce. November 2023 showed what happened when it tried. This is not a story about bad people making cynical choices. The investors were behaving like investors. Microsoft was behaving like a company protecting a major strategic asset. Altman was behaving like a CEO whose position depended on performance. Each actor was responding rationally to the incentives in front of them. The problem was not the actors. The problem was the structure, which claimed to hold the mission above commercial pressure while simultaneously creating conditions in which commercial pressure was always present, always large, and always pushing in the same direction. Adding more safety messaging to a structure that incentivizes speed does not solve the problem. It decorates it. When Jan Lake resigned from OpenAI in May 2024, he did not leave quietly. Lake had led OpenAI's super alignment team, the group specifically tasked with figuring out how to keep highly capable AI systems under human control. His departure statement, posted publicly, described a culture in which safety culture and processes had taken a back seat to product development. He was not speaking in abstractions. He had spent years inside the organization building the infrastructure that was supposed to ensure the mission held. When he concluded it was not holding, he said so on the way out the door. His exit told a story that no press release could fully manage. Lake was not alone. A pattern of departures from OpenAI's safety-focused staff had been building for months before his resignation made it undeniable. Researchers who had joined because they believed the mission was real found themselves working inside an organization that moved at product speed, measured success by benchmark performance and user growth, and treated safety evaluation as a parallel track rather than a prerequisite. Several described in public statements or interviews after leaving a growing distance between what the safety teams recommended and what the organization actually shipped. Musk's response to what he had watched building for years was not only a lawsuit. In 2023, he founded XI, his own AI laboratory, structured differently, with a stated commitment to publishing model weights and operating with greater transparency than OpenAI had maintained. Grok XI's first public model was released with open weights. The choice was deliberate and pointed. It was a demonstration that the open approach OpenAI had abandoned was still technically and commercially viable for a well-resourced lab that chose to pursue it. Is not a neutral actor in this story. Musk's motivations are genuinely mixed, and the AI safety community has not uniformly celebrated his intervention. Some researchers who care deeply about the risks of advanced AI regard Musk's approach with as much skepticism as they regard OpenAI's. The structural critique he made through the lawsuit does not require him to be a reliable alternative. The critique stands or falls on its own merits, independent of who made it. What the broader research and developer community noticed, and what the departure numbers reflected, was a question that had been implicit for years and was now unavoidable: which AI labs' incentives can actually be trusted. That question, spreading through developer communities, enterprise procurement teams, and policy circles, was doing something that no single lawsuit could do alone. It was changing the weight of the decision for anyone evaluating which systems to build on and which organizations to believe. Microsoft's position in this story is worth understanding precisely because it is the weight that makes the whole structure immovable. By the time Musk filed his lawsuit, Microsoft had committed more than $13 billion to OpenAI across successive funding rounds. That capital was not passive. It was embedded in Azure's infrastructure roadmap, in Microsoft's product strategy for Office and Bing, in the enterprise contracts sold to companies that were building their own workflows on top of OpenAI's API. Removing OpenAI from Microsoft's plans was not a decision anyone at Microsoft could make. It was a dependency that had been built into the architecture of one of the largest technology companies in the world, and a dependency of that scale does not tolerate slowdowns. This is why OpenAI cannot fix the trust problem by announcing better intentions. The ads in Windows were bad, the telemetry was frustrating, but those were policy choices that a different leadership team could theoretically reverse. What OpenAI faces is different. The capped profit structure requires investor returns. The investor returns require commercial acceleration. The commercial acceleration requires shipping products faster than careful evaluation typically allows. The nonprofit's oversight role was the mechanism designed to interrupt that chain. November 2023 demonstrated that the mechanism could not survive contact with the financial pressure surrounding it. Removing any link in that chain now means removing revenue, removing relationships, removing the cloud infrastructure the entire operation runs on. There is no version of that conversation that ends well for anyone holding equity or managing an enterprise contract. Governments have begun to notice. Regulatory inquiries into OpenAI's governance and its relationship with Microsoft have emerged in multiple jurisdictions, examining whether the nonprofit-to-commercial conversion represents an antitrust concern or a breach of charitable purpose. These processes move slowly. The technology they are attempting to regulate does not. Meanwhile, the ecosystem that OpenAI once dominated has grown more complicated. Meta began releasing its Llama models with open weights. Mistral, a French AI laboratory, built a significant research and commercial presence on the same open-source philosophy that OpenAI had originally promised and then abandoned. The premise that frontier AI required a closed, centralized development model, which OpenAI's post-2019 trajectory had implicitly argued, was being tested in public by organizations with access to serious compute and serious researchers, and the results were not obviously supporting it. The broader consequence is a shift in how trust operates in the AI industry. OpenAI was never loved the way some technology products inspired genuine affection, but it had something more durable than affection. It had a structural claim on credibility, an architecture that said, regardless of what other labs do, we are the ones you can trust to hold the line. That claim was the organization's most valuable asset. It was not a feature that could be patched or a product that could be improved. It was the foundation, and foundations, once cracked in public view, do not return to their original condition by announcement. Users are not withdrawing from OpenAI's products because those products lack capability. ChatGPT remains extraordinarily widely used. The withdrawal is happening at a different level, in the decisions of researchers about where to work, developers about what to build on, enterprises about which vendor relationships carry long-term risk, and policymakers about what kind of oversight is actually necessary. That is a slower erosion than a product failure, but it is also harder to reverse, because it lives in judgment rather than in features. OpenAI was built on the argument that concentrated AI development, without accountability, was the thing to be afraid of. It built a structure specifically to prevent that outcome, and then, step by step, decision by decision, it became the version of the thing it was designed to prevent. When the organization built to protect us from that future becomes an example of it, the question is not whether trust can be rebuilt inside that particular institution. The question is whether anyone is building the institution that actually holds. Drop your thoughts in the comments.